Good afternoon. I'm Matt Frank. I'm the director of the William E. and Carol G. Simon Center on Religion and the Constitution at the Witherspoon Institute, where I've had the great pleasure of working closely with Tom Farr, Tim Shaw, and the other members of the International Religion Task Force, the culminating work of which is the volume you all now have copies of. I was pleased to play a role as an editor of the volume, but in just a second I'll say more about the young scholar principally responsible for the words between the covers. Our panel is titled, as the book is, or similarly to the book, Why Religious Freedom? But this particular panel devoted to the question of the challenge of grounding religious liberty. On what basis can we find a ground for religious liberty? We have four really distinguished contributors to our discussion today. Starting to my immediate left, Timothy Samuel Shaw, who was mentioned earlier by both Tom Farr and Robbie George. Tim is the Associate Director of the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center at Georgetown University, and is a visiting professor in the government department. He is the author with Monica Toft and Dan Philpott of a splendid book, God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics, published last year by Oxford, I believe, and is also editor of a series Oxford publishes on evangelical Christianity and democracy in the global South. Tim is the principal author of this book, and whatever you find meritorious in it is very, very likely to be Tim's doing. He's a splendid wordsmith and a clear and perspicuous thinker. See, clear and perspicuous repeats myself, doesn't it? See, you're already better than I am. Seated to Tim's left is William Galston of the Brookings Institution and the University of Maryland. He holds the Ezra Zilka Chair in the Governance Studies program at Brookings and is the College Park Professor at Maryland. Previously, he was a professor in the School of Public Policy, director of its Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, and among his other roles here in the nation's capital, he was, from 1993 to 95, Deputy Assistant to President Bill Clinton for domestic policy. Bill is a familiar voice in many journals of opinion. If you follow politics, you're going to run across Bill's writing sooner or later. Another wordsmith to his left, Amy Sullivan of Time magazine. She's a contributing editor to the magazine and writes the political blog Swampland. She specializes on the relationship between religion and politics. She's written for many newspapers and magazines you see listed in her biography, and perhaps most interestingly published the book The Party Faithful in 2008, subtitled How and Why Democrats Are Closing the God Gap. And finally to Amy's left, and this is exactly the order in which they'll speak momentarily. To Amy's left at the end of the line is Wilfred McClay, Bill McClay, who holds the SunTrust Chair of Excellence in Humanities and teaches history at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He's also on the National Council on the Humanities and is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. Bill McClay has written several books, great work, The Masterless Self and Society in Modern America, which is hard to believe came out now 18 years ago. The Student's Guide to U.S. History, which is published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and Religion Returns to the Public Square, Faith and Policy in America. Bill, too, is one of those writers you're going to bump into if you follow political, especially opinion journalism. He writes frequently for First Things magazine. His essays and reviews are seen there, as well as commentary and other journals. So in just a second, I'll turn over the proceedings to Tim Shaw. I've asked the panelists to take about 10 minutes each to address what they regard as the challenge of finding the ground of religious liberty. About a week or so ago, I emailed them and suggested that they might consider any of the following things, although they're not bound to consider even one of them, and they have complete freedom. First, is there a principled basis for religious freedom, or does it rest merely on pragmatic calculations about peaceful coexistence? Second, is religious freedom a distinctly modern phenomenon, or does it have older roots, perhaps in ancient religious traditions themselves? And third, does religious freedom stand apart somehow from other basic freedoms? Is it less or more fundamental than others? Is it the paradigm of other freedoms, or is it derivative in some way from something more basic? Is the protection of religious liberty risky in some fashion? Following their opening remarks, I'll ask the panelists to respond to one another for a little time before opening the floor up for questions from the audience. So, to begin then, Tim Shaw.
Thank you very much. I can't thank you enough for coming. I'm extremely grateful for this occasion. It has been a great honor to be working with Matt Frank and with an entire task force of outstanding thinkers on international religious freedom. It's been a great privilege to work with Tom Farr, my colleague at the Religious Freedom Project as well, and a great privilege to be speaking alongside this eminent group of scholars. So thank you very much. I feel really quite overwhelmed. And also, I feel, let me say, quite sober. And that's really the theme of the brief remarks I want to make this afternoon. It's easy, sitting in a comfortable lounge in Georgetown University, to forget the human dimension of the issue that we're talking about this afternoon. Professor George touched on it briefly in his remarks, but I want to begin, if you'll forgive me, by waxing personal. We heard brilliantly from Robert George, waxing philosophical. And you'll see when you read this book that there are philosophical arguments here as well. But I hope you'll forgive me, given that the theme of this panel is grounding religious liberty. I hope you'll forgive me if I wax personal a bit and talk a bit about the ground of my own concern about religious liberty. I suppose it really goes back to precisely 10 years ago this day. Precisely 10 years ago this day, I haven't heard much discussion about this in the media in this country, but 10 years ago today, a terrible pogrom occurred in India, the country of my father's birth, country where my wife is from. Hindu nationalists organized a pogrom and over 3 days raped, murdered, killed, destroyed large sections of the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat. And by the end of it, more than 1,000 mostly Muslims were left dead. I remember I was on vacation when I first started getting the newspapers about this event. Day after day, the pogrom continued. I'm familiar with this part of India. My father is from this part of India, Gujarat. And I was horrified to read day after day that middle-class Indians went out into the streets and targeted systematically, in a premeditated fashion, their neighbors, their fellow citizens, simply because of their religious faith. I had no interest in religious freedom prior to this. I was a political philosopher, mostly thought about the 17th century, not the 20th century or the 21st century. But something about reading what happened, something about my own family's affinity with the context, truly shocked my conscience. It horrified me beyond belief that in a democracy, India, fairly well-ordered, stable democracy, that middle-class, well-educated people could be motivated by such hatred, such bigotry, to attack fellow citizens simply because of their religious faith. And if you read the accounts of what was done, the deliberate use of rape as a weapon against Muslim women, the targeting of Muslim businesses, systematic destruction of Muslim businesses, using gas cylinders which were thrown into shops and homes and then exploded with windows being blown out. A former member of the Indian Parliament who was a Muslim and his entire family were immolated by attackers. So I was awakened through this experience personally. So in a sense, I want to emphasize that this is personal. It's philosophical. It's important to make arguments and to try to think clearly about what is the ground of religious freedom. But for me, the ground of my own concern for religious freedom and the ground of religious freedom, period, is the dignity and worth of human beings. The dignity and worth of every human being, including every one of those human beings, more than 1,000 of them, who were killed, innocent people, murdered 10 years ago. And if you add up the victims of religious persecution all around the world, the numbers go very, very high. According to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, a nonpartisan research organization that Amy has worked with, that I've worked with, according to their best analysis and evidence organized by an outstanding sociologist, Brian Grimm, according to their analysis, 7 out of 10 people in the world, 7 out of 10 people in the world live in countries in which there are severe restrictions on religious practice. 70% of the world's population lives in countries where there are systematic, severe attacks on religious freedom. That, my friends, is the only reason for us to be gathered here today. There's no other justification, there's no other reason for meeting than that many, many millions of people, not just a few hundred or a few thousand here and there, but millions and millions of people all over the world are victims of religious persecution. And it's also worth underscoring that religious persecution is an equal opportunity killer and an equal opportunity destroyer of human dignity. There is no one community in the world, no one religious community or political community that has a monopoly on victimhood with respect to violations of religious freedom. It's not just Christians who are being victimized. It's Muslims, like the Muslims that were butchered in the streets of Gujarat 10 years ago, like Shia Muslims in Malaysia, who don't even have the freedom to meet in mosques, who hardly have even the most basic religious freedom. It's the Muslims in Jordan, every one of whose mosques is owned and controlled by the government of Jordan. Every one of the 2,000 or 3,000 mosques in Jordan is owned and operated by the state, and every imam in the country is told what to preach by the government, is given a sermon that they have to deliver. There is no free or autonomous space, as we discuss in this book, for religion, effectively, in the country of Jordan. So all around the world, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists are victims of religious persecution. And it is squarely an affront on human dignity. Now, some people would argue that surely the other array of human rights that we recognize, rights of speech, rights of assembly, rights not to be killed, why do we need religious freedom? Don't the other rights that we all recognize, aren't those adequate to protect, for example, the Muslims who were victimized 10 years ago in India? My answer is no. Let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that some diabolical religious bigot invents a chemical agent whereby it would be possible to manipulate or control or change someone's religious beliefs painlessly. Let's say it were possible for a Hindu extremist in Gujarat to introduce into the water supply a chemical agent that would change or transform the religious beliefs of Muslims so that they stop being Muslims. Let's say it were possible to repress religious minorities in that part of the world without inflicting any pain, without inflicting any torture, without threatening them. What if it were possible to do it painlessly? What if it were possible to somehow alter people's religious convictions, bypassing their own will, bypassing their own reason, bypassing their personhood and agency? What if that were possible? I would argue that it would still be wrong, that it would still be a fundamental assault on their personhood, even if it were done without any physical pain, even if it were done without violating any one of their other rights. The argument of this book is that religious freedom in and of itself, even if it could be done ex hypothesi, even if it could be done painlessly without violating any of their rights, would be a grave fundamental assault on human personhood. That's the fundamental argument of this book. The argument is fundamentally that regardless of the victim, regardless of how it's done, regardless of how one might say painlessly it might be done, or even if it were done cleanly, it would still be fundamentally wrong. And yet, the fact that religious freedom is so systematically violated, the fact that there are so many violations of religious freedom, the fact that this is such a pervasive problem generates far too little discussion. 10 years ago, when hundreds, more than 1,000 Muslims were being killed in Ahmedabad and throughout Gujarat, even though this was not an issue I was working on, I was moved to try to do something. I tried to organize discussions and events in Washington when I was at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. The response was a deafening silence. There was no interest in this issue, or very little interest. Naturally, organizations that were concerned about Muslims were concerned. But apart from that, there was very little general interest. This was not really about terrorism, about America's national security. This wasn't really a major issue. This same neglect, the same failure to recognize that this is a distinctive issue, that this is an important issue, the same neglect continues today. And that's also why we felt moved, Matt Frank, Tom Farr, and those on the task force felt moved to try to produce a document that would dramatize and underscore the importance of this issue. And so that's what we did. When I showed the book to my daughter yesterday, she was disappointed that it was so short. Some of you will be disappointed that it's too long, I suspect. I know the members of the task force, when they first were presented with some of my drafts, were horrified by how long they were. So this will be too short for my daughter, and too short for some of you, and perhaps too long for others. It's not an academic treatise. It doesn't solve every philosophical or theoretical problem. It's not meant to do that. It doesn't provide theoretical foundations for every single argument that's made. But it is meant in a short space to be a manifesto, to say this issue deserves more attention than it deserves. Human beings throughout the world are being assaulted at the core of their personhood, at the core of their dignity, and it's something that more people should be doing more about. So I hope you'll read the book. I hope you'll take action. I hope you'll think more about this issue, the way it affects all of us. And it's also worth saying, just in closing, that this issue is increasingly one that we're discussing in this country. Many of us are part of religious communities, in fact, that are facing threats to our own religious liberty. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are facing bigotry that does amount to a threat to their dignity, a threat to their religious freedom. Sikh Americans are facing threats to their religious liberty. The Catholic hospitals and other institutions are facing threats to their religious liberty. So the kinds of grave threats to religious liberty that, frankly, most of us thought when we started this project were restricted to countries outside are actually increasingly coming home. We face more and more threats here, so it behooves all of us, in part because of what's happening here, to think much harder about why this issue is important and to take action. And I hope you'll do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Bill Galston.
Well, as Tim was sharing the anecdote of his daughter's reaction, I was reminded of an 18th century French author who sent his latest weighty tome to a friend with a cover note saying, "I would have written a shorter book if I'd had more time." So don't feel, what this showed, this was deeply meditated and therefore terse. To ward off misunderstanding, and not out of any pleasure in talking about myself, let me begin by saying that I'm here and I speak as a sincere friend of religious liberty. Those of you who are familiar with any of the academic and philosophical work that I've done over the past decades know that that is the case. Reference was made in the introduction to my 2.5 years of service in the Clinton administration. One of my proudest moments was to represent the Domestic Policy Council on the administration team that helped get the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to and then across the finish line. And I will never forget the spectacle on the South Lawn that fall of all of the faiths of America gathered in celebration. It was you know, a celebration it was, a celebration of America as well as of faith and the multiple faiths that make up the rich tapestry of religion in America. And just a couple of weeks ago, a co-author of mine and I released either a long paper or a short monograph, depending on how you look at it, under the Brookings imprimatur on the clash between provision of health care on the one hand and religious conscience on the other. I cannot imagine that it made for an entirely comfortable reading at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue if anybody deigned to read it. So it is against that backdrop that I offer the following thematic statement for my remarks, that we friends of religious liberty do our cause no service if we fail to address the philosophical, theological, and practical challenges that it encounters and that it generates from within. And I want to focus very briefly on 4 such challenges, beginning with where the document does, with the, so to speak, anthropological grounding of religious liberty. I am very sympathetic to that way of beginning, but when you begin that way, you are driven immediately to the question of how distinctive religion is anthropologically. Let me read to you the first sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which I assume every undergraduate at Georgetown has to read, and that sentence reads, "All men by nature desire to know," a profound anthropological statement. But that desire to know is not entirely congruent with the religious impulse as described in this document. There is some overlap, but these are not congruent, fully congruent areas of human activity. And that forces us to attend to the fact that there are multiple foundation human goods, not just one. And that raises a wide range of issues, including the possibility that these multiple goods in a single human life or in a single human community are not wholly harmonious with one another. What happens when the clash is not between good and evil, but between good and good? What happens when the good of religious liberty encounters another fundamental human good? How do we weigh that? That is not just a prudential or practical question, that's a philosophical question. The document more than once mentions the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Well, if you read Article 18, here's the way it begins. Everyone has the right to freedom of, and then the triad, thought, conscience, and religion. Well, what is the relation between thought and conscience? What is the relationship between conscience and religion? These are not easy questions. The Supreme Court has grappled with these questions in a very interesting way in the course of its developing jurisprudence in the area of conscientious objection. And they began in the 30s and 40s with the thesis, well, of course, that was an exclusively religious phenomenon. In about a quarter of a century, through a series of steps, each one of which is worthy of attention and respect, they were driven to the conclusion that there are people for whom the elaboration of conscience outside the venue of religion takes the same identity-forming and moral outlook-shaping role, assumes the same role as religious faith and theology do for people of faith. So these are questions, it seems to me, that a document like this suggests, and which in the longer version that you had too much time to write, would have to be attended to. Here's the second challenge. We talk about religion, but what is religion anyway? As a distinctive human phenomenon, the authors make a brave attempt to answer that question, but as I think they would have to acknowledge, and indeed obliquely do, there are many, many counterexamples and difficulties. In the course of trying to think this through, I did some research on a really fascinating episode that occurred in Catholicism in the 16th and 17th century when the Jesuits went to China and first encountered Confucianism. And they then grappled with the question, well, is this a religion or isn't it? And they decided that it wasn't. And because they decided that it wasn't, they were enabled to do various kinds of business with Confucianism. Well, when news of this got back to Rome, the Dominicans and the Franciscans were not amused, right? They quickly arrived at the view that Confucianism was a religion and therefore would have to labor under the same disabilities that non-Catholic religions did within Catholicism at that time. But that's, but setting aside the question of persecution versus toleration, there is a serious question there. What do you do with bodies of belief and practice such as Confucianism? Are they religion or are they not? Are there clear, bright line defining characteristics of religion as a human phenomenon? I'm not so sure. For example, not all religions place the same emphasis on the unseen or unheard dimension of religion that the definition offered in this document does. The founding moment of Judaism was neither unseen nor unheard. And moreover, there are deep disagreements within theology, even within the theologies of specific religions, about the human capacity to grasp transcendent reality without revelation, special grace, or authority that goes well beyond reason. And I have to say that on my reading, there's more than a whiff of modern natural law doctrine in this document, and I'm very attracted to that doctrine as an only partially defrocked Aristotelian, but it's hard to regard it as definitive of religion as such. Third challenge, does religious liberty fit equally comfortably within all faiths? And I'm not posing that question abstractly. It's a question that leaps out at you if you look at the three short religious essays in this document representing the Abrahamic faiths. For Jews, and I am a practicing Jew, Jews in the first place may be the chosen people, but they are not the choosing people. God may have chosen us, but there's a huge debate within Judaism as to whether we were at liberty to choose God. And the debate in the Talmud on that point is riveting if you are of a mind to be riveted by such things. And furthermore, within Talmudic Judaism, the status of conversion to a religion other than Judaism, if you are a Jew, is extremely controversial. The idea of liberty of entrance and liberty of exit is at the very least controversial within Judaism. And of course, within Islam, the status of apostasy is a matter of continuing discussion. And the author in this volume makes a valiant effort to distinguish between the real Islam on the one hand, the Islam of the Quran and the Hadith, and on the other, Islamic jurisprudence, a distinction that I think makes about as much sense as the distinction between real Judaism and the Talmudic tradition. But perhaps there are Muslim scholars who wish to take me up on that point. So the question of whether religious liberty, as we now understand it, does or does not have a specific religious and theological inflection strikes me as a deep one. Now, of course, if one believes in modern natural law reasoning, then that's irrelevant because religious liberty is not necessarily grounded in any faith, let alone a particular faith. Since we're in Washington, I cannot restrain myself from pointing out that if it is indeed the case that one can ground religious liberty and by extension all of the founding liberties in our constitutional tradition through reason alone without resort to faith, then there are a lot of people out on the campaign trail right now who appear not to have gotten that message. And if I have a word of advice for Professor George, it would be to draw out that implication of his reasoning and make those who listen to him very carefully aware of it, because they appear not to have taken that step in their reasoning. But that's just me. The final question is, what is the relationship between religious liberty and the imperatives of civic order? This is not merely a prudential question for the following reason. Whatever theology or philosophy may say, in practice, we can enjoy the security of religious liberty only within a secure framework of law and domestic tranquility. Look at what happens to religions in circumstances of anarchy, right? Look almost anywhere in the Middle East to get an answer to that question. And so it is always legitimate to argue that the exigencies of the rule of law and domestic tranquility may require some restriction on the practice of religious liberty. And then the question is, what are the circumstances under which we reasonably judge that to be the case? I have a long list of cases, but no time to discuss them to remain within my 10 minutes. So I will simply conclude by saying that religious liberty, in my view, is a great human good. But it is not the only great human good. And on occasion, it may have to give way to one or more of those other goods. And so the balancing of religious liberty with other human goods is not just a way of muddling through. It is a moral and rational imperative in its own right. Prudence, as the philosophical tradition understands it, is never irrelevant to the exercise of liberty, even to the exercise of the first liberty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Amy Sullivan.
Well, thank you. It is really a pleasure to be here to talk about this issue. But I have to say, whenever I'm at Georgetown, I feel an obligation to come clean and to let you know that despite the fact that I'm a Sullivan, I'm not actually Catholic. I'm a Baptist. Maybe one of the few Baptist Sullivans, but that still gives me membership in a religious tradition that highly values religious liberty, and particularly the separation of church and state as a way to protect religious liberty. So I feel like I have at least something of a background to bring to this. My other confession is that I am not a lawyer, I am not a philosopher, I am a journalist, as much as that is looked down upon in many circles. So my talk today is going to focus on what I see reporting on the intersection of religion and politics, particularly in American politics. That's the context with which I'm most familiar, and it's the context with which we have, I think, been largely talking about religious liberty over the last few months. And picking up on the point that Bill ended with, I think the question of how to balance religious liberty against other concerns and rights is a key one. Reading through the book, I really did not find much to disagree with at all, and kept kind of nodding my head and saying, well, definitely, I think in the American context, we fortunately don't have this struggle over whether most people find religious liberty a legitimate concern or not. Occasionally, you'll find somebody like Bill Maher, who does not believe that religious people should have what he would call special rights. But by and large, that's an exception, and I think we're very lucky in the US that that is the case. A few months ago, when the contraception mandate was still being debated, and the White House had not announced their final decision, which turned out to not be a final decision on that. I posed a question to my Twitter followers, and let this be noted that this is the first time I've cited my Twitter followers in a talk. But I wanted to know seriously whether people thought that religious freedom was still something worth protecting, or whether they thought that that belonged to a bygone era and might have been something that the founders were concerned with, but that really didn't apply to us much anymore. And I was interested because my followers span the scale between folks who are very conservative politically and theologically to proud atheists and agnostics and other secular liberals. And to a person, they said that they thought religious liberty, of course. It was as if I was stupid for posing the question. They said, of course it's important to protect. And nobody disputes that key assertion. So I think we're not here necessarily to talk about whether religious liberty is a value that we can make an argument in favor of in the US, but instead how we talk about religious liberty. And the question posed to us as presenters was, what are the challenges? The challenges that I have seen most recently covering politics are challenges to maintaining an ability to talk about religious liberty and the issues that come up within it in a serious way, in a way that doesn't trivialize it, and in a way that remembers the context, particularly the worldwide context in which this value comes up. As Tim told us with his opening anecdote, this is a matter of life or death for a lot of people around the globe. And I think it's vital that we keep that in mind. In our current discussion, and particularly on the campaign trail, which Bill hinted at, there are some difficulties with how religious liberty is discussed that I think make our ability to debate these questions as a society more difficult. Phrases like an assault on religious liberty or a war on religious liberty, which you'll hear quite often from figures like Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, raise the rhetorical stakes in a way that I think makes it more difficult to have good faith, if you'll pardon the pun, discussions about religious liberty and the very real questions that come up when you're looking at balancing different interests. Even in the case that the Supreme Court decided earlier this year in Hosanna v. Tabor, the court decided 9-0 that it was pretty clear that the questions involved were to be decided on the side of religious liberty and on the side of religious institutions to decide for themselves who qualifies under the designation of a minister or a similar employee. But that doesn't mean that it was useless for that case to be taken all the way to the court. I think the question of how you balance off the rights of an employee and whether that employee should be protected in terms of being dismissed from her job against the rights of a religious institution to get to determine who fills ministerial capacity positions for them, those are serious questions and questions worth considering, not a question that if you posed it to the man on the street would necessarily have an obvious answer. And so again, despite the fact that the court was of one mind on this case, I think it was worth being considered. That said, most of the issues that we've seen in the last year, maybe the last 2 years, I think, have been troubling from the standpoint of people taking seriously the idea of religious liberty. And here I just want to take a few minutes to go through what I think are some of the more negative approaches to this discussion that we've seen. There's no question in my mind that when it came to figuring out a solution to the contraception mandate and the imposition it posed for religious employers, the White House committed a huge unforced error. And certainly if they'd paid more attention to the writings of Bill Galston and Melissa Rogers last fall, they might have been able to save themselves a large amount of grief. But one of the really troubling things for me as I've been covering this issue is to hear all of the arguments coming out of the White House and the White House's supporters that until very recently almost completely ignored the issue of religious liberty, treated it purely as a question of whether we were going to provide contraception to all women. And you would hear many, many times the figures such as, well, 95% of Catholic women use birth control. Ta-da, as if that ended the discussion. And there was a real either complete ignorance of the fact that this was an issue that dealt with religious liberty, or a willful ignoring of the fact that religious liberty was in play. And this was not just a question of access to contraception, which I personally support. But it was, it signaled that this was going to be a debate that was not going to be pleasant, because you had, on one side, the White House treating it almost purely as an issue of women's rights. The same could be said, and it's become such a cliche to cite New York Times editorials at this point that I almost didn't include this, except that the editorials the paper has written on religious liberty and on the contraception mandate in the past few months have made this same willful mistake, I believe, refusing to acknowledge issues of religious liberty. And focusing, again, only on the issue of whether women should or should not have access to contraception, which I would argue is a completely different issue. It's certainly not the reason that people like E.J. Dionne and Mark Shields and Melinda Henneberger took issue with the administration's first stab at finding a solution on the mandate. But that's not to say that all of the problems have been on the left. Just this morning, I was reading Cardinal Dolan's latest blog post. And again, just as citing my Twitter followers, the fact that I can cite a Cardinal's blog post feels a little odd. But I was reading his latest blog post about his continuing objections to the mandate. And again, was nodding my head at a number of them, but then came to his concern that, among other things, the White House has refused to give proper acknowledgement to the tricky religious liberty issues involved, which I would have some more sympathy for, except that in my memory, the Cardinal himself and the Bishops' Conference in general has not cited at all the concern of women on the other side. And that worries me, that both sides are having a debate where they claim only one kind of interest as valid, and the other doesn't even make it onto the table. I think it's really hard to find common ground solutions in that case when you won't even acknowledge the other rights that are at play. It gets even more egregious when you look at two of the presidential candidates who are still in the race for the Republican nomination. Newt Gingrich has called this particular mandate by the administration, quote, the most outrageous assault on religious liberties in American history, which calls to question for me Speaker Gingrich's background as a historian. Because I could name a number of assaults on religious liberty that, not to trivialize the current debate, could be construed as more outrageous. And perhaps it's just that he is fairly new to the Catholic tradition, but if he were to look into the history of anti-Catholicism in the US, he would find things like mob violence in Massachusetts in particular in the 19th century, in which Catholic buildings, Catholic churches were burned to the ground. Catholics themselves were killed. At the end of the 19th century, many states put through what were referred to as Blaine amendments, making it not possible for tax dollars to go to parochial schools, which was a policy intended only to target Catholic schools. And even in the last century, I was reminded just this week of the Oregon law in 1922 that essentially made it illegal to attend Catholic schools, which would seem to me a at least more explicit assault on religious liberty and attempt to go after Catholics in a much more targeted way than perhaps is happening at the moment. Rick Santorum, his latest way of talking about what he perceives as Obama's war on religion is to assert that President Obama has replaced the phrase freedom of religion with freedom of worship. We've heard this a number of times over the past few years, accompanied by speculation that this is laying the groundwork to, in fact, take away most religious liberties from people of faith and to allow them simply the right to gather in their churches or houses of worship to worship together. It may not surprise you to hear that, in fact, the president has not replaced religious freedom with freedom of worship. In fact, George W. Bush used the phrase freedom of worship very often throughout his 8 years, and in fact used it much more often than Barack Obama does. He used that phrase 3 times, in fact, in 2008, declaring Religious Freedom Day, and although he did use freedom of religion most often, used the two, in fact, what seemed to be interchangeably in many addresses. James Dobson, who has one of the people who's very concerned about Barack Obama's language and whether he is getting rid of freedom of religion, himself talks about the important value of freedom of worship. And makes clear, I think unintentionally, that it's possible to use that phrase without intending to do away with religious rights altogether. I'm also concerned about the inconsistent application of charges that religious liberty is being infringed upon. Again, I don't think it's at all times a unsubstantial charge, and in fact, most of the time is a very important value to be protected. But it worries me when folks apply it only in one political context and not in others. And just to bring up a couple of examples, we heard a lot, especially prior to the passage of health reform, about whether that particular law was going to involve conscience protections for healthcare workers. And this is something that's come up in debate a lot in the past decade and a half. And it's certainly something that people of faith have sincere concerns about. However, it has not escaped my notice that the Bush administration waited 7 years and 10 months into Bush's terms in the White House to strengthen conscience protections through the HHS for healthcare workers. And I don't remember hearing through those 7 years and 10 months much about George W. Bush's assault on religious liberty and failure to protect the rights of religious persons who are healthcare workers. In the same way, Newt Gingrich's continuous concern about religious liberty and wars on people of faith is not a consistent concern. You may remember the discussion a few summers ago about the building of an Islamic center in Lower Manhattan. And Speaker Gingrich's leading role in trying to gather public opinion against that and prevent the center from actually locating itself near the site of Ground Zero. I've found it interesting that we've heard very little about whatever happened with that debate. It was as if it sprung up out of nowhere a couple summers ago and then disappeared. In fact, the center was built and now runs and is not the site of daily protests by Gingrich or anybody else. But I think that it was the debate itself of a few years ago that's most worrisome, because if we're going to argue for religious liberty, I think we can't pick and choose. We can't say that it applies to Christian Americans, but it doesn't apply to Muslim Americans. That nobody would dare to tell a Baptist church where it could locate its building and its house of worship, but that we should absolutely be able to say to Muslims, you cannot have that Islamic center there. Why? Because the other issue at stake is public sentiment. That traditionally has not been a right that has been deemed as important as the right to religious liberty.
Amy.
And finally, I would just say that when I and others end up pushing back against these this use of phrases like assault on religious liberty and war on religious liberty, we usually hear things like, well, they started it, which is not a phrase normally associated with mature debate in a democratic society. And so I would propose that we get rid of all arguments about who started it and who's most to blame, and instead focus on making sure that when we talk about religious liberty, it's not in a way that trivializes the term. It's in a way that makes it easier for us to take it seriously, both in those places where religious liberty is threatened here in the United States, and importantly, abroad. Thank you.
Thanks. Batting cleanup, Bill McClay.
Yeah, one of the disadvantages about coming last is that all your best insights have already been stated by other people better than you were going to state them, and your bad ideas have already been sort of exposed before you've even uttered them. So I've been editing a little here in my mind, but actually what I wanted to do is still pretty much intact. What I'd like to do is, and I'm really stepping back from the immediate issues that Amy was talking about, to think about two aspects of religious liberty, and I think two misconceptions about religious liberty, broad misconceptions that this book and this effort, I think, go a long way towards exposing and perhaps reversing. At least they ought to give us pause and make us think more deeply. And I'll say what the two are first and then talk a little more detail about them. First, it's often asserted that religious liberty, religious freedom, I use the terms interchangeably, means a waning of religious sensibility. It's made possible by the lessening of intensity of religious belief, that in the ultimate case, tolerance is begotten by indifference, and that a religiously tolerant society is an increasingly secular one. This, it seems to me, is at the very least not necessarily so. And I think a good argument here is made why it isn't, that a robust understanding of religious liberty can be religiously grounded. There's a whole chapter on the religious case for religious liberty. And on being embraced in those terms can lead to a deepening of religious faith rather than the diminishment of it. In other words, religious liberty may in some ways enhance the practice of religion. That's point one. Point two, and this, again, is tucked into the text, but I'd like to bring it out more boldly because I think it conceptually be useful in addressing some of the questions that came up in the last session, some of the questions that Bill Galston has raised. And that is that religious liberty has to be understood not merely as an individual liberty, an expressive liberty, but as a corporate liberty, as a liberty that inheres in groups, that applies to groups, and that such an understanding of religious liberty is at the very core of what we mean when we talk about ourselves as a pluralistic society. So let me talk about each of these two in a little more detail in succession. First, the wide, although far from universal, acceptance of religious freedom as a fundamental human freedom enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, countless other places, owes much of its genesis to liberal political thought. This is a tradition that provided the basis for mediating and overcoming the wars of religion at the dawn of modernity. It's a great debt, I think, that the concept of religious liberty owes to liberalism. But it also, and perhaps surprisingly, provided tools for the deepening and development of religious practice. You can see this in some of the American founding documents that are related to religious liberty. And one of them is quoted at length in the book, James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which was directed against the possibility of religious assessments to support the established church, which he opposed on the grounds that it constituted an unacceptable coercion of conscience. And here he meant conscience, very much tied to the duties that one owes to the Creator. In doing this, a political argument was also shown to have, or had brought out in it, profound religious implications and repercussions. Madison's liberalism underwrote the dignity of the individual, the same concept, the same dignity in which the concept of religious liberty is rooted. Yet it was being regrounded, made to rest on a foundation something deeper than, or at least different from, the merely political. The effective practice of religious liberty derives energy and support from liberalism, but in the end it also stands to some extent on its own legs. And permit me, if I may, to illustrate this with a personal example, since we began with a personal example. About 6 years ago, I was invited by the State Department to, and I'm not really sure why I was invited to do this, but I was, and I took the opportunity to go to Turkey and lecture around the country on the concept of religious liberty and particularly separation of church and state in the American context. So I did. I had a kind of master lecture, which I used in modules and for different audiences over the 2 weeks that I was there. Spoke to all kinds of different groups. Fascinating experience. It's unforgettable because you think of 6 years ago, there's still a lot of ferment on these issues. It would be a different experience to go now. But everywhere I went, people were rapt in their attention, and they wanted to know, the first question, despite all my disclaimers, was, do you think this could work in our country? And I would say, look, I'm not competent to answer that question. I'm really, in my talk, I emphasized all the elements of contingency and historical particularity that brought the American settlement to the state that it is, and that in fact it's still, as Amy, I think, has brought out, it's still contested, it's still being negotiated all the time. Anyway, one particular encounter lingers especially in my mind, and that's the one I wanted to tell you about today. I was brought to a Center for Advanced Study in Islam on the Asian side of Istanbul, and was greeted there by a group of absolutely wonderful scholars, Muslim scholars, several of whom who had copies of my books that they wanted me to autograph, which is, of course, you can't resist that kind of attention. And they listened. I gave the full version of the talk, since I had a more sophisticated audience, and opened the floor to questions, and the questions went on for a long time. Very interesting, very probing questions. One woman in particular stood up and asked to explore the concept of religious toleration. And her series of questions, went right to the heart of the matter. Didn't I accept the Christian view of the primacy of love, she asked. Yes, I said, I did. I said nothing anywhere I went in Turkey about being a Christian. It was absolutely just assumed by everyone. So actually, they didn't permit me to speak in a detached scholarly voice. Well, she continued in a gently questioning voice, how can it be love? How can it be love for you or me or anyone to permit another person, someone we love, to believe something that we know not to be true? And she, at the moment she asked this question, it was electric. You could feel the energy in the audience because she had asked the question everyone wanted to ask, but maybe we're feeling a little too polite to ask or whatever. But this was the question on their mind. How could toleration be anything other than an illegitimate trespass of the political in the realm where it absolutely did not belong? Or to put it in my earlier language, how could toleration be anything other than a dilution of faith rather than a fulfillment of it? I wasn't ready for this. For all sorts of reasons. I wasn't ready for such an intense question. And it was very clear I was expected to answer on behalf of the Christian faith and not just as some random scholar from the United States. But there was no place to hide, and I didn't want to be rude, so I did my best. And I put it, I'm going to work from my text here to make sure I get it right the way I put it. What I tried to do, though, was to show that the liberal practice of toleration could be understood, and I think is best understood, for me at any rate, as something that can be grounded in theology and in an understanding of God's nature and man's relationship to God. In this view, God desires our love, but he suffers us to come to him freely and willingly, not by fiat, not by manipulation, and certainly not by coercion. So he leaves us free, not only to believe, but also to err and stray. In fact, the possession of this freedom, the freedom to withhold or give our love, our faith to our Creator, could be thought of as an essential part of what it means to be made in the image of God. And in this interpretation, which I was fashioning on the spot, an instant theologian, could be a way of understanding the story of the fall of man. In a way, the fall of man is an expression of God's love for us, since he loved us enough to permit us the freedom to disobey and reject him, and a freedom we would never know for sure that we possessed if we hadn't transgressed, if we hadn't had the grievous experience of abusing that freedom. So and this is still me answering the Turkish lady, so yes, I concluded, that is how it can be love, as we understand love. And here I think I was emphasizing the we that I was expected to speak for. To tolerate in others error, not because we are all postmodern liberals who believe that truth is pragmatic and provisional and perspectival and no one can know anything for sure. So the main thing is not to believe anything too strongly, to have sort of an epistemic modesty about everything and not be cruelly subjecting others to our subjective beliefs. Not because we're all million liberals who believe in the marketplace of ideas settling things. Not because we're people of feeble faith who confuse the politically, socially convenient with what's required of us by God, but instead because at least as strong a reason as those are all reasons, as strong a reason and stronger for me, and I hoped stronger for this audience, was the commitment to non-coercion flows from a theologically grounded commitment to the fundamental and intrinsic dignity of each individual person. Well, this answer went over very well. And in fact, the Said essay in this volume echoes the same kind of argument. So I think that there may be further good that can be done with it. The second misunderstanding, and I'll be a little briefer about this, is this question of religious liberty being not merely individual, but applying to groups. Benedict XVI has alluded to this problem. He did recently when he spoke to the American bishops about, quote, a worrying tendency to reduce religious freedom to mere freedom of worship without guarantees of respect for freedom of conscience. To protect freedom of worship on these terms, he argued, is to protect an essentially private right, and no more than that. But to regard religion as a private, individual affair with no permissible public implications is to deny the belief in our intrinsic dignity and integrity, without which even liberalism itself can't long endure. Furthermore, to go back to the word I used at the beginning, religion is a corporate liberty, not merely an individual or expressive liberty. It is both, and this is part of the complexity of religion considered within the this tradition of liberties and freedoms. It is individual, it is something else, something more. It's an associative liberty. It's a liberty to form groups, to form moral communities that have their own structure, that have a substantial degree, not absolute by any means, but a substantial degree of autonomy in choosing and adjudicating their membership, in choosing their leaders, in formulating their doctrines, their internal practices, their form of polity, their worship, their employment, to go to the Tabor case. So it's really about, to put it in a simpler way, it's about the ability of a religious organization to be itself. That's all that calling it a corporate liberty means, to be a coherent we rather than a collection of I's. And if you think about it, it's somewhat incoherent to speak of religion as something that only an individual has. Nobody has a religion any more than anyone has a language by themselves. So these are, by their nature, cultural, group, collective, social things. And without that recognition of the corporate dimension of religious liberty, it becomes a meaningless or a much diminished concept.
Thank you, Bill. Well, to quote Robbie Burns, this is one of those things that oft gang agley. Tom Farr and his staff forgot to install the small taser circuits in the chairs so that I could discipline the members to 10 minutes. Therefore, unless, to borrow the language of the Supreme Court this time, unless one of the members of the panel feels a compelling interest in addressing the remarks of one of the other members of the panel, we'll go straight to audience questions. And the microphone is being toted by, oh, then you're closest to the first person, right here.
Hi there, Josh Good. I understand that you probably know today's blunt amendment was voted down 51-48. I'm curious, for those of us who do see this HHS contraceptives mandate as a primarily religious freedom issue and not a women's health issue, if you might offer any creative strategies for making that case with a silent middle.
Any takers? You know what the blunt amendment is that he's referring to.
I'll just note that I saw on the way over, I got an email from the Bishops' Conference's media office. And their note on that vote was of a slightly different tone than I'll say I've heard recently, which is to say that they saw it as a positive sign that the senators could spend some time actually talking with each other and trying to come to an accommodation instead of just merely seeing this as a political fight that was an easy up or down vote. That may be too optimistic a spin on this, but you know, in keeping with what I was trying to talk about earlier, I do think that they would benefit from a discussion that really weighed the concerns on all sides, instead of just seeing this as, are you for women or are you for religion? Because that's a debate that doesn't do any of us any good.
I would add that I think that a lot of the controversy over the Blunt Amendment in the Senate concerned the range of its language and the impact it would have on various things not immediately within the purview of all the recent controversy over contraception. And so I think that the fact that even after all of that debate, there were still 48 votes for it suggests that with some adjustment and maybe more carefully drawn language in subsequent efforts at legislation, that they might get over the 51 threshold for something. Remains to be seen. Go ahead, Bill.
I think the readiness with which many conservative Catholics have found it hard to stay away from reopening the question of contraception shows what a difficult concept religious liberty is. Because I'm in the camp of I'm not a Catholic, and I don't agree with Humanae Vitae, but I think the mandate is wrong from the standpoint of the violation of religious liberty. And so I observed the opposition with some perplexity that people, to my mind, can't keep that straight. They mix the issues, and they really ought to stick with, and the bishops themselves mix the issues.
Over here, the gentleman just in from the aisle in the center.
Hi, I'm Amjad Chaudhry. I'm from Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And just Dr. Shah had mentioned about the state of Muslims in India. And I'll say that, yeah, there are so many atrocities that was done in India to Muslims. But at the same time, the Muslims also came back to Mumbai and killed so many innocent people. So what I'm saying is, and also Dr. Shah mentioned that what is the way of bringing peace to this world. And I'm believer of second Messiah. We believe that Ahmadiyya Muslim community believe that the second Messiah had come. And so he said that love for all, hatred for none. And for 120 years, we have been persecuted in many, many countries, like in Pakistan, like in Indonesia, like in many other countries. But we have not retaliated to any of these killing or suppression and these things. And what we do is we go back and pray to the God, that God give them the wisdom to understand what's going on in this. And I'll say this is the basic principle that we adhere to, and that is the way to bring the peace. And actually, if you look at the religious liberty, for so many centuries, we have gone through and we have come to this stage. So it will take some centuries to bring it back to the peace and peace of religion.
Thank you.
All the way at the back by the steps, the gentleman standing.
Austin Roos from CFAM. Just a little defense of perhaps the sometimes overheated rhetoric of some of the political candidates. The Blaine Amendment failed at the federal level, though Blaine amendments were enacted at the various states. The riots in Boston were mobs, and Catholic property was protected by the state. What's going on now is not just the federal government directing Catholic institutions to provide contraception against their conscience, but the federal government determining what is, in fact, a Catholic institution. So when the charge is made that this is over and above instances of anti-Catholic activity in the United States, there is some resonance to that. I would just like a comment from some of the other panelists.
Can I respond?
Amy, go
Um,
ahead.
I take your points, but I continue to argue that language like war on religion or assault on religious liberty intends to wrap these all up in an intentional campaign against religious faith that I don't think is taking place right now. It actually gets to the one question I had about the book, which is the subtitle, Why Now? We didn't quite get to the why now in the US, and I think there are some arguments to be made, certainly the concerns with minority faiths and efforts to limit their religious freedoms. But I just caution against taking some isolated incidents that I believe can certainly be argued that religious liberty was either overlooked or not carefully enough considered in terms of who's doing the defining. Certainly the question of self-insured institutions is something that was not considered even in the second accommodation that the White House put out, and they're continuing to work on. But again, I caution taking that and taking an HHS grant and taking, the supposed replacement of freedom of religion with freedom of worship and making out of all of that the charge that a particular administration or political figure is waging war on religion. I don't think that sets the groundwork for a particularly productive discussion about the religious liberty issues that we've been discussing and that need to be hashed out in a pluralistic society.
Bill Galston?
Yeah, let me build on those remarks. There are two kinds of political discourse in a pluralistic society. Those that are designed to open up a conversation and those that are designed to shut it down. I'm in favor of the former and flatly opposed to the latter. And so let me just say for the record, the Catholic Church is not, as some of its adversaries have charged, engaged in an assault on women's health, nor is the Obama administration engaged in an assault on religious liberty. Those are deliberately inflammatory phrases designed to mobilize bias and antipathy and to make the reasonable discussion that we need in our divided society impossible. And I deplore them both. And I think it is absolutely correct and necessary for people of goodwill on all sides to call out the abuses of political speech that are disfiguring and distorting our political landscape to the disadvantage of all of us, whatever we believe. That's point number one. Point number two, it was the state that persecuted and hounded the Mormon Church out of existence in the 19th century, literally out of existence. That was not a mob. That was the state. And so even if one takes the distinction between state action and mob action seriously, I find it impossible to subscribe to the proposition that this is anything like the most serious assault on religious liberty in the history of the American Republic. It's a preposterous proposition.
Thank you, Bill. Tim.
Let me say this. I share the worry about much of the heated language. I will say that I think perhaps the elephant in the room in this discussion is a radical shift in the way the elites in our society, our opinion leaders, our political leaders, other leaders, academics, think about the place of religion. I do think that to the extent, and this has been documented, to the extent that there has been a shift in the thinking of elites in the United States, this is documented, for example, in an excellent book by Christian Smith called The Secularization of American Public Life. The thinking of elites in America has unquestionably changed on a whole range of issues. Many issues it's changed for the better, issues of race and issues of religious tolerance. But I would say on this issue, the issue of according religious liberty some sense of respect, some sense of value, I would submit that some of what we've seen in this administration, but in other administrations as well in recent years, isn't a deliberate assault on religious freedom. It's a failure even to think about religious freedom. It's a failure even to consider it, and just precisely the way you described it, Amy, with which I completely concur. It wasn't a sort of people sitting around and thinking, how can we attack religious freedom? It was precisely the opposite. In a sense, the failure was a failure of people even to consider it as an issue, even to consider it as a distinctive problem that deserves discussion and that merits intelligent conversation. Where there isn't a slam dunk obvious solution on either side, I completely agree with Bill. The purpose of this book isn't to provide a kind of neat algorithm which is going to generate a particular solution to every problem. It doesn't give that at all. There are particular... Yeah, that's right. We're working on it, but it's not in this book. But no, it's not possible, of course, to come up with such an algorithm. But the problem is that we're sort of generating policy algorithms in which religious freedom doesn't even figure as a variable. It's not even one of the principles that's in the balance. And that's true in our domestic politics increasingly. It's true in our thinking about foreign policy. It's not that anybody is out there making war on religion. It's that people on the left and the right simply don't even consider it as a major issue or social priority.
If I can take a moment to speak my own view, it's very similar to Tim's. I think that Gingrichian can go into the dictionary as a synonym for hyperbolic. And yes, you know, I have a dear old friend, now retired political scientist, where I once taught at Radford University, who said to me some of the wisest words a fellow political scientist has ever said. He said, when you watch what happens in Washington and you have the choice between two explanations for political action, one of which is a conspiracy by evil geniuses, and the other of which is sheer boneheadedness, you can never go wrong by adopting the explanation that what happened was due to sheer boneheadedness.
Unless you're writing a trashy novel, in which case it's essentially to adopt the other perspective.
Right, if you're Scott Turow,
Right.
you know, you have to have conspiracy theories. So I agree with Tim entirely that the difficulty I see with the Obama administration's recent missteps, Amy called them unforced errors, on religious liberty, is simply a failure to notice that it was standing at the threshold wanting to come in the room, and they weren't listening. Bill?
I just feel, as the former director of graduate studies at the institution where Newt Gingrich got his PhD, I feel as if I ought to defend him, but I won't.
All right.
But I do want to say something serious, that the way this book begins is with a seemingly abstract and wonky sort of observation about how the secularization thesis that held sway for so long in social science and so on has been utterly dismembered, and is among social scientists who are thoughtful about these things, and even people like Peter Berger, who were for a long time the exponents of the idea, have now reneged on it with great force. The problem is that the thesis is still out there in the air. It is in the standard kit of assumptions that an educated person who comes out of an American university today carries around with himself or herself. That is, that religion is part of the infancy of the race, and it's on its way out, and there's this kind of death throes that we see going on, but it has no future. Well, this is clearly not empirically true, and we would approach these things different if we just went on the assumption religion is going to be with us for as long as we can see.
That's been an exploded thesis since Auguste Comte first wrote of the religion of humanity, I think. But yeah. Thank you, Bill. On that note, I think we have to draw this panel to a close. Please join me in thanking our panelists.